So inspiring. You actually reminded me of Margaret Mead's famous quotation. It's essentially this, don't think that a small group of committed individuals can't change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Wow, yeah, this group, you, each one of you, one, entering into the knowing of our oneness. So welcome everyone to u-nite, Unity Temple's weekly interspiritual service. I'm Reverend Nhien, and I am delighted to be here today to share a lesson on something that's very alive for me right now, which is change. Yeah. So some of you might have already heard the news. For those of you who haven't, I will be sharing it in the course of today's lesson. I want to not just welcome you here, but also give a shout out to our YouTube subscribers. Technology is so amazing now that there are folks that I'm now working with one-on-one and doing Enneagram-based spiritual tutoring because they watch YouTube and are coming from all different states. So this is really amazing to kind of see the ways that what we do here impacts the broader world. So with that, I think I'll just save everything else for today's talk. And then should always be a rule. There shouldn't be songs that make the minister tear up before speaking. There should be a rule. Whew, okay. So as a minister, I have the blessing of getting to witness miracles in people's lives, like on an almost daily basis. And this is so phenomenal. And one that I want to share with you today has to do with a gentleman in our u-nite congregation who's in his late 70s and who historically in his life has been very scientific-minded, focused on, we'd say, like the facts of a situation, what you could research, what you could prove, what you could quantify. And for those of you who are familiar with the Enneagram typology, connects with being a self-preservation 5. And so this gentleman has been coming to our Enneagram and Contemplative Practices group for, 2 years or so. So not even that long of a time, right? Has been coming steadily and engaging the practices that I've recommended here, a practice of surrender, of dying to your old self through centering prayer and welcoming prayer. Recently, this gentleman took up poetry, something that is so beyond like the left brain mind, right? Poetry. But not just reading poetry, writing poetry. Not only that, but at the poetry party that I hosted on Thursday of just this past week, to my surprise, he attended this poetry reading, and I was like, wow, that in itself felt like this amazing, touching miracle. During the time, though, classic to his style as the classic observer on the Enneagram, for the bulk of the beginning of the evening, many people shared. I shared my poetry. Other people shared the poetry that they wrote. Other people shared the poetry, their favorite poems that others wrote. And during that time, the room for me, my own heart was just opened up. There's something about art, poetry, all these sort of right brain arenas that for me helped to point me toward an experience of love, of the sacred, of unity and oneness. And then finally, though, as I noticed that this gentleman was awfully quiet, but perhaps typically quiet, the group and I sort of invited him to share. And it so happens that he had been working on poetry, but then called what he had, just drafts, not actual poems that he had written. And so we invited him to simply share the few words. Hey, share your draft. Put it out there. Let us hear what's on your heart. And he said yes, and he did. And the words that came out of his mouth touched me to no end in a way that I haven't been able to stop thinking about them all week. The first word I heard was froze. Froze. It's other words synonymous to words like shaped, bent. And I asked, do you have a name for this poem that you've been writing? And he said, yeah. How the twig is bent. How the twig is bent. Just when I heard that phrase, my heart just went, kind of broke open. How the twig is bent. Like I flashed back to all the ways that moments throughout my life had shaped me, right? This idea that, as the twig, how have I been bent by life? How have I been froze? How have I been fashioned or shaped? And what of that? What has come from that? And so as I reflected on the topic that I had already picked for today, what came alive for me was the beauty of this. So this was Thursday night. It so happened that I had the gift of being able to visit with the same person on Friday afternoon. So I had the chance to go deeper and explore and learn more about these lines of poetry that were fascinating me to no end. And as I discussed it with this gentleman, I invited him to do something for me so I could see more clearly what was on his heart and in his mind. I took out a sheet of white paper and I said, could you, those words that you have scattered, could you put them on the sheet of paper, but draw them, write them down like you're writing a tree? What would be the words that would be the trunk, and what would be the words that are like the branches and the twigs? And so it was like, okay. And so he did this. And when he did, I don't know, possibly even apologetically, he looked at me and says, well, actually, Nhien, there are two twigs. I noticed that some of the words I put on this one twig were words that were about like closing, being closed off. One twig ended. But there was another twig on which he wrote these other words. Words like, will not be overshadowed, seeking sunlight, expression. And in that, I was blown away again by how deeply this person had touched into what I felt like was my life experience and what I feel is a universal experience. So let's go back to the idea of change. I'm going to put that story on pause and invite you into an exploration today with me on these three pieces that have to do with change. First, what are the changes that have occurred in our lives? Of course, to some degree, life is always changing, but right away in your heart and your mind when you think about the things that have been significant changes in your life. What are the outer changes that have marked your life? First. Second, what are the inner changes that have happened as a result, as a product of those outer changes? What did you come to be? What did you come to look like after these significant events in your life? And third, I'd like to invite us into a place of power, of being self-empowered to get where we have choice in the matter of change, not always choices as to what changes seem to happen to us, sometimes against us, sometimes for us, but seemingly circumstantially. Even the changes that are the result of our choices, we don't always know all the ramifications, of the circumstances that change just because we make one decision, right? And so those changes that seem to flood us and impact us, how we have power and choice in that, and how that choice point makes all the difference. Not what happens to us, but what we choose in the midst of it. And so let's begin by considering, what are the biggest changes that have happened in your life? I'll invite you to just go back to your childhood for a moment. For some of us, if we can remember back that far, for some of us, puberty, right, was a massive change, a hormonal change, a change that affected sort of how we position ourselves in the world, our self-consciousness, etc. For some of us, it was the death or loss of a loved one, maybe even a parent, at that early age in our childhood. It could have been a loss through death or illness. A parent became ill and therefore unavailable to us to meet our needs, or a loss through divorce. For some of us, we experienced that early in life, where our parents divorced, and that changed our lives substantially. It impacted us. Again, I'm not just talking about changes that happen in our everyday lives, but the ones where we know we've been marked by it. For some of us, it's just even starting high school, right? Big change. Maybe moving. For me, in my childhood, as you know, I didn't just move to another state. We fled a country. We immigrated from Vietnam to here. That was a substantial life change for my family and thus for me that impacted my future forever, right? Indelibly. Childhood. So what from childhood changed for you? And then in early adulthood, for some of us, going away for the first time, going away to college. For some of us, getting a, quote, real job for the first time, maybe a 9-to-5 job, having to be responsible in those ways. For some of us, it was getting married in our early adulthood. For some of us, it was everybody else getting married that we knew, or everybody else having children, and us not. But that changed our lives. In early adulthood, some of us, and we can even go back to childhood for this, some of us were changed by a person harming us, by abuse or by neglect. Something happened and it changed us. Some things happen and they change us and we feel better. Some things happen, they change us, and something in us feels like it dies or it closes off. But these are just some of the markers. You have your own, and I invite you here today to take note. Take note of the milestones in your life that have made all the difference in who you are today. And then later in adulthood, perhaps it's retirement. For some of you, you supposedly retired, but then ended up working some more. But still, there's a change in your relationship to the world. For some of you, you call it the third act. This way of like, oh, what now? Where I did that outer work, and now maybe I'm doing the inner work. And also, later in time, perhaps an illness, a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis, an injury, the loss of a spouse, the loss of more family members as you age, friends. taking note, being aware of how the substantial milestones in your life affect who you are today. And so on the outside, those are just a few examples of the things that circumstantially happen. So let's talk about now interchange and what that maybe even means. So I'll invite you to consider, by example first. So growing up, so recently I've shared here that I've spent some time with Effie, who is a golden retriever. And this is really my first experience with a dog. And it's just brought me so much joy to kind of develop a relationship with an animal, but I've never had that. Why? When I look back to my childhood, my mom was very asthmatic and also had a lot of allergies. Like she said she was allergic to basically everything. And so we never had pets in the house, and I always assumed that it was because of this, that she was just too allergic, and so we didn't own pets. Well, when I was in, my late 20s, I was interviewing my mom for a book that I was starting to write about the family. And so as I did, I found out all these things about her childhood, like the fact that she owned a little dog named Kiki. And I found out that my mom adored, just loved this little dog, and she was an only child, so this dog was like her life, and her love. And one day she came home from school and walked into the backyard and saw that Kiki had made her transition, had passed away. And as a little girl, my mom said to me, that day, I said, I'm never going to have a dog again because I don't want to love and lose in this way. I had no idea that it was because this shift happened in her life, so she closed her heart around this relationship of love. As I reflected on this story that my mom shared, I looked back at the situations in my life, the things that changed for me. Becoming an attorney. Do you think becoming an attorney is going to open or shut your heart down? I think we all have the capacity for both, but when we're not yet conscious, and I was definitely not even on a conscious path then, I could see how what in me was still alive and poetic and expressive wanted to just shut down and get to work. The ways in which my life force I felt I wanted to minimize and shut down. So what in your life, from all of the incidents that came to mind for you, can you think of one first in which you reacted by shutting down? Interchange. Just bring that to heart and to mind right now. What happened that shut you down? For me, I'll share pretty openly that there was a relationship in which I probably, I felt like I was sexual or physical too early. And I remember in that moment feeling the pressure to do that, and then afterwards shutting down my body completely to where I wasn't even in touch with my body or my heart for years after that, because I just felt like something in that I betrayed myself, and the only way to protect myself was to shut down. So even if I was still engaging in relationships and dating, that something in me had shut down. Then I'd like for you to look at a life circumstance, a change that happened, maybe the birth of your child, or becoming an aunt, like for me, something that changed, that resulted in your heart opening, and what that felt like. What was it? The moment you said, I do? I remember when my brother had his first baby. That was the first time I became an aunt. I flew all the way to Montreal where they were. And in my Facebook feed just this morning, there was a memory of a video I took of her in her little swing and just how amazing that moment was. But it wasn't just because of my niece that opened my heart. It was watching my brother become a man in a whole different way that opened my heart. What's happened in your life? What big changes have opened your heart? What little changes were big because they opened your heart? Maybe a class that you took that just went, wow, right? Maybe a trip that you took that helped you to see the world in such a more expansive way, that helped you to see your own biases and your own limitations and helped you to expand in your thinking. Changes on the outer that impact who we are, not just for a little while, but who we become for a sustained time in the inner. Did you lose somebody, and in that loss, did you close your heart? Or did you keep it open? And through keeping it open, expand to larger community and other relationships and connections? What inner changes happened for you as a result of the significant outer changes in your life? And now, as I stand today, sort of on the threshold of a very major change in my life, and for those of you who don't already know, I'll just make a record of it here. So for those of you who don't already know, on Tuesday, I stepped down from my salaried associate position here at Unity Temple in order to pursue my passion for global transformation using the Enneagram and contemplative practices, but to sort of march out into the world in a way where I feel is the next aspect of my spiritual calling. And oh boy, what a mix of emotions I've been. Extreme excitement, release, freedom, feeling in flow, feeling the blessing of tremendous support from Unity Temple, from Duke, who happily wants me to stay and do as much as I want to do here around the Enneagram and contemplative practices. But then, we're not people who didn't even know the announcement had been made, reaching out to where, within the week, I had a request to do Enneagram-based tutoring for someone in Israel. And then I had a request from a Unity minister in D.C., access to all the churches and local spiritual communities in that area who are excited and eager for contemplative practices and the Enneagram, that within a week, even people who didn't even know about this started reaching out to me. The universe knows. Amazing. And in the same week, moments that I don't even expect to happen, right? Where I'm sitting there happy, then I'm crying, then I'm crying, and I'm sad that things need to change, that things are changing, that I chose this, but then as I think about that, I was like, well, I chose this choice, I made this choice point, but I have no idea what lies ahead. Okay, so fear. Nhien, did you really just do this? And people are telling you it's courageous, which means it's a dangerous thing. I'm like, oh, it really got to me that oh, I don't know what I'm going to do completely. I'm going to have to trust in spirit in a way that I haven't had to before. How crazy is that? So all of these mixed feelings. But as I stand on the threshold of change, I realize more and more that it's never been from my birth till now. It's never, ever been what has happened to me. So it can never be about what might happen or not happen to me. It's always been about who I am as a result of what's happened. Who I am is what I carry through every moment of my day. And as I reflected on this, I felt empowered not only for the moment and into the future, but I looked back and I realized there was still some cleanup to do, change, that in my inner world, I was still holding on to things that can impact my capacity to move forward expansively into the future. That there were choice points I made along the way that I reacted to by saying, close your heart, protect yourself. Don't get too excited about this new opportunity because it might not happen. Energy that stops and closes. It doesn't move. It paralyzes. But the beauty of the conscious spiritual path is that I get to own that I'm not small because I was hurt in that way or betrayed in that way. I made myself smaller and limited because I chose to react to that circumstance by closing my hope off in that way, in that circumstance, by closing my joy off in that way. Like, don't get too big for your britches. Are you going to close yourself off? Or could I revisit those moments and those milestones now? Can you revisit those critical moments and find the ones where you closed and make a conscious choice to open? Do we not think that the past there is being held in us, in our being now, in the present moment? And if it is, then our relationship to it can be altered in the present moment. We have the choice to go back. Oh, and even when we talk about poetry, it is the legal world that totally took all sense of poetry out of me. And I was writing in a very linear way. And for me, the joy recently that I've shared before about of reviving my heart, my way of seeing the world, that it mattered. As a lawyer, and this is only how I interpreted, I had to just give work product back in response to what you requested of me. There was nothing organic and alive that was coming from my own heart. And in that way of shutting down and saying that what was coming and emerging from my own heart was not important, I realized that I stunted my own creativity, one that I have just begun in the last few years to allow again. In my family of origin, as many of you already know, I felt very rejected and I felt like I didn't fit in. And so I remember the moment as a little girl that said, I don't need your love. That's baloney, right? But I don't need your love. So I shut down, acting like I don't need that. And how does it come out in my life today? That there's a part of me, as I've shared recently, that's now working on, where are my barriers to intimacy? Because I so fear that the same thing is going to happen, that they're going to know me like my family knew me, and I'm not going to be good enough. There's still a little part, a nagging little part. I could go back there and make a different choice in my heart right now, so that today my life can be vibrant and open. What points in your life can you open now? What moments of your openness, where you naturally opened, could you go back to today to resource your present day? To remember how the feeling of openness, if we've been struggling for a while, sometimes it's hard to even remember what it's like. So you can revisit those choice points where you opened and resource yourself in that way. Amazing. And so as I stand on this threshold and allow for everything to be what it is, this unconditional welcome of my fears, my hopes, my excitement, my grief, my loss, all of it, to welcome and embrace this present moment, this glorious moment of life, and to say this change, whatever happens, there are moments like Thursday, I went to our CPE group, our core group, and I went home that evening after CPE, after a visioning meeting for the future, after the poetry reading. I went home like floating on a cloud of bliss. It was so supportive and healing. And I remember saying to my heart and to myself, remember this feeling. Because whatever happens in the future, in the moments that you struggle, you will resource yourself with the feeling of expansiveness that this has. Resource yourself with that opening. And remember in your heart and in your body what it feels like to be open to so much good. Powerful to make this a choice point so that every moment, something that was going to make us want to protect ourselves, oh no, of course there are going to be challenges as I move forward. It's not going to be all those blissful flow days necessarily. That in those moments, I open that choice. You know, I actually had the honor of being the commencement speaker at my college, the School of Humanities. I was a philosophy major. And for some reason, the quote that I shared in that speech, maybe because that was a milestone moment in my life, it came back to me just this morning. Life, Matthew Arnold said, life is not a having and a getting, but a being and becoming. We fret over the things we want to get, the people we want to get, the jobs we want to get, hold on to. But if we could let all of life and life experience just move through us and invite the idea that maybe the only thing we ever really have is who we are. That, I thought about my path to ministry. And I remember having great clarity as someone said, whoa, that's exciting that you want to become a unity minister. Even back then, though, I was very clear. I said, hey, I may become one, I may not. I'm clear that it's my path to move in that direction. But more important than achieving the goal of becoming a unity minister was the person I would inevitably become as a result of traveling that path. It was going to open my heart more. I was going to pray more, definitely more than I did before spirituality, working as a lawyer. The things that the path of ministry invited me into were points at which I could open my heart, come into the person that I was meant to be. And so it helped me to see how whenever change happens, whenever big change happens, if I see it as an invitation into a being and becoming, what parts of me have not yet been revealed in the world and expressed in the world? Maybe this change is inviting those out. Maybe I'm being invited to be more compassionate to myself and others. Maybe I'm being invited in what seems like a circumstance that wants to shut my voice down. I'm being invited to learn how to use my voice and speak my truth. It's the person that I'm being invited to become as a result of this change. Maybe those of you who feel more attached to the form of u-nite, staying as it is, that there's something about this change that says, I'm actually resourced in my inner being now. I see the strength in me. I see how I can go with the flow so much more than I could a few years ago. And that's going to have to come out even more. I'm going to become even more trusting that the form of the new will be as good, if not better. And my coming to trust that changes my inner landscape so that I become someone who trusts in the ground of being more deeply. Who are you invited to become at this moment in your life in the midst of the changes that stand right here, present moment before you? Life is not a having and a getting, but a being and becoming. And I'll close with I'll close with words by one of my dearest friends and longtime Unity minister, Insight meditation teacher, Robert Brummett, from his book, Finding Yourself in Transition. And then I'll close with the poem that I was referencing at the beginning of today's lesson. From Finding Yourself in Transition. Indeed, every change is a type of death, a death to an old way of living or being. Yet ironically, change, a dying to the old, is one of the defining characteristics of growth. To live is to grow is to change is to die to the old. Jesus of Nazareth said to his disciples, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. John chapter 12, verse 24. The Apostle Paul, who was no stranger to unexpected change, writes to the church at Corinth, I die every day. Many of us today, writes Robert Brummett, are living in an accelerated pattern of growth and change and are, like Paul, dying daily. And so I was deeply inspired, I'm continually inspired by the people who participate in our community, to see people of every age continue to thrive and grow. And what it takes to transform and grow, to stay hopeful in a world that can often bombard us with conflictual, hostile, painful circumstances. That what that takes is a kind of dying to an old way of being and allowing not the circumstance, not the person who betrayed you, not the politicians that cause you to feel mistrustful, not to surrender yourself to be fashioned by those circumstances, but to allow yourself in the sacred space of prayer and meditation to be fashioned by God, to be fashioned by the light, to be reborn into this living daylight that is the perpetual, constant in our world, the very fabric of our existence. I'm continually in awe by watching those of you who are willing to make this choice point where the surrender, the dying, is an opening. The dying is an opening, an expanding into love. With this, I'll close by the poem by our very own George Benner, How the Twig is Bent, by someone who's never written poetry till now. Shaped, froze, directed from the dawning of one's day, bent, not broken, not to be overshadowed, new navigation, growing toward sunlight, growing yet set, growing to fullness, has all its need to bear fruit, and first to flower, to bear fruit, and first to flower in expression. And so I invite you to take to heart that poem as reflecting the choice point that we universally face on a daily basis, to feel fashioned by life, but not to be overshadowed, to grow towards sunlight, to know that you have all you need to bear fruit and to flower. So I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing so. And as you do, I invite you to drop your attention into your heart space. Be aware of whether your heart feels closed or open in this moment, amidst the present circumstances of your life. Will you try to protect yourself against life, against being hurt? Or will you open? Will you choose to distance yourself from love and light? Will you be that twig on the tree? Or will you be the twig that reaches toward the sun, that opens, that allows the beauty and warmth that is always present to nourish and fill you no matter what is happening in your life today? And will you say yes to that? To recognize that the gift you offer the world is the flower and the fruit of your opening toward the light. And the recognition that the twig is part of the larger tree, never separate, resourced at its root in the one life that we call God or Spirit or love. And so I invite you to drop even deeper now into the silence of your own being, inviting yourself at this moment in your life, noticing maybe what has been closed off because of prior changes, inviting yourself to open a little or a lot as you're willing, here now in the silence. And as you bring your attention gently back into the space of this room and your bodies here in this space, I invite you to make my words your words in the silence as I pray that I am willing to let the present change happening in this community and in my life be a catalyst for my transformation, that I may bear greater fruit, that I may flower, that I may feel the sunlight and know my exquisite beingness in God. And so it is. Amen. Thank you, each one of you, for being here today.